Good morning, everybody. Nice to be back on the Future of the Left Fringe again. And I'm delighted to welcome in the studio Esther, Giles and Tony Greenstein, and by live link, hopefully, Jackie Walker, for a discussion about freedom of speech and the left, and how we manage issues such as cancellation, no platforming, etc., etc. But just before we start into that discussion, I will just give people a little bit of breaking live news, which I expect our visitors will be interested in. Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader, was being taken to court by Richard Millett, a pro-Israel activist, and that case has been settled and dropped now without any order of costs, without any offers from Mr. Corbyn to not speak about such issues in the future or to apologise. The case has been dropped. Mr. Millett also notably appeared over the last few days in the Al Jazeera exposés, the Labour files, which showed him and other activists engaged in various meetings and so on. And I would recommend that people watch that. I think it will be of interest. So Esther, Tony, and do we have Jackie? I can't see her on the screen at the moment. Here we are. Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
There, we've got you. That's great.
Hi.
I'm going to jump more or less straight into the discussion. I will just say, obviously, I'm sure I'll have no problems with keeping everybody civil, but I will be expecting that and enforcing it if necessary. So, freedom of speech. In what circumstances is it okay or even necessary to close down the right to free speech, if it is necessary at all? Esther, let's give you a first go on that.
Quoting Beatrice Evelyn Hall, a quote you'll be familiar with. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So, in my view, speech should not promote acts of violence. So, I think perhaps that may be where the line should be drawn. We can discuss that. If someone says something a reasonable person would believe to be something so appalling it should not be said, then it might be called out. So we should refuse and reject the rhetoric of violence, in my view. However, dehumanising speech should be allowed to be said and called out and challenged, rather than being allowed to fester in dark corners. So that's my starting position.
Yes. Jackie, if you're still there, can we come across to you? You've been a victim of an awful lot of
refuse and reject
very questionable free speech.
However, dehumanising speech should be allowed to be said and called out and challenged.
So can I get your take on this? Because lots of things have been said about you that were vile and horrible, but you've probably got an interesting aspect on the consequences of free speech potentially.
Very questionable free speech.
Well, lots of things were said to me that were vile or about me, but they were said.
Yeah, it looks as though we've lost sound there from Jackie while we get her back. And Tony, can we go over to you? What's your take on this issue?
Well, I don't think, I support free speech, obviously, but there are no absolute rights in this world, and free speech is amongst them. I agree with Esther. I defend to the death the right of someone who I disagree with to say what they do, and Orwell said very much the same, that free speech, freedom of speech is about hearing speech that you don't particularly like. That's right. But I think the difference is, and I think it was John Stuart Mill who first espoused this idea, that where you're in the essence arguing for the harm of other people, like for instance racists or fascists, then there is no entitlement to free speech. They're using free speech not to debate ideas, if you like, in the world, but to basically say there are certain people who shouldn't be allowed to live. Now, in those cases, there is no free speech. Speech sometimes does have a material weight, I mean, we saw that with the anti-Semitism nonsense in the Labour Party. It was completely irrational, had no basis, there was no evidence, and yet everyone assumed there was anti-Semitism, you know. So the same with free speech. So, I mean, I'm reading a book now on the 43 group, a group of anti-fascists after the war who set about the Mosleites and stopped them rebuilding a neo-Nazi movement in this country. And when they saw a meeting, they smashed it up. They didn't debate with the fascists and on the finer points of whether Jews were subhuman or not. They didn't allow them to thrive. And after 4 or 5 years, the fascists folded their tents and went away. So was that in the interest of humanity? Of course it was. Yeah.
You do get some people who argue that if you're going to have right-wing people onto, I don't know, programs like Question Time, it famously had a National Front representative on, if I remember correctly. And they would say, well, if you let them speak, it just exposes what they're really about. So you should, by and large, allow them to say the stuff because people will recognise the poison at the point when they're coming out with it. So, I mean, what do you make of that, Esther? Is it should we allow people to expose themselves, not in that sense, expose who they are by allowing them to speak on these kind of programs?
That's my point about exposing dehumanising language. So anything that is based on a premise that somebody is inferior as a human being to somebody else, I think it needs to be exposed, it needs to be called out. We need to shine a really bright light on it so that people can see. Because otherwise it will be said, but it will be said in dark corners and it will fester and it will create something much worse.
And I think as well there are subtleties that people use when it comes to using language that's likely to harm people. You know, I wrote an article a few years ago about the fact that, you know, in my opinion, the people who were constantly trying to associate Jeremy Corbyn falsely with terrorism were probably putting his life at risk. And we did see the guy who went on to kill somebody in front of a mosque also had Jeremy Corbyn on his hit list. How do you draw that line? How do you know, where do you put the line and who gets to put it? In terms of...
I mean, it's not black and white, is it? Because if it were soluble, we'd have solved it. But so for example, if somebody was brandishing a baseball bat and saying "kill the turf," for example, in my view, that should not be, that we should call a halt to that. So it's immediate threat of harm or violence that has to be judged, in my view.
Tony?
Yeah, I don't think there's any major difference with Esther. I mean, I'm prepared to debate, and I mean, I have on social media with Holocaust deniers because it's absolute nonsense what they say. And it's quite easy to point out why it's nonsense as well. Even though they may want to repeat the Holocaust, I'm quite prepared to knock down their ideas in a debate, say, like this today. But where you have groups of fascist thugs, and I gave the example of the East End after the war, who were setting up meetings at street corners with the sole aim of building a movement protected by stewards, who were thugs in themselves, in order to intimidate the local Jewish community, who then go on to attack that community, and the physical attacks are an inseparable part of that so-called free speech, then it's quite clear that the 43 group were right, and anti-fascist action was right in the 1980s and fascist in the 1960s and 70s with the National Front, to destroy them and their ability to organise, and that includes stopping their meetings. Their meetings are part and parcel of building a fascist threat. And I don't think the left should sit idly by and just say, oh, well, this is the battle of ideas, and we must entertain them like it was a gentlemanly parlour game. It's not. I mean, fascism to some people it means death in essence, and we saw that in Eastern Europe during the war. As I say, freedom of speech, absolutely. But the freedom of speech today, which has been curtailed, is of the left, not the right. It's anti-Zionists and supporters of Palestinians who are most under threat because of the attacks on free speech by this Tory government. I mean, Professor David Miller at Bristol University, sacked because he had the wrong ideas. I mean, that's what's happening.
Yes, I mean, Professor Miller was sacked counterfactually as well because I believe it was in two separate investigations into him commissioned by the university and conducted by lawyers, found that he'd said and done nothing anti-Semitic, and yet they bowed to the pressure that was whipped up to get rid of him and treated him appallingly, I think. I'm told we've got Jackie back. Is that before we move on to the next bit? I want to bring you in, Jackie.
Hi, can
So-
you hear me properly?
Yes, we've got you now. That's really good. So the discussion so far, in case you weren't able to hear, was
I heard it.
primarily on the kind of right-wing extremist
Yeah.
speech at the moment. We're going to move on to something different in a minute, but give us your take on that, because I'm sure you've experienced plenty of the negative side of that kind of speech.
Okay, so I actually think there are two reasons to limit free speech. One is, if there's violence, we're all agreed on that. But the other thing is that if there's a threat that your organisation or you are going to be sued, because I don't know about anybody else, but I don't want to lose my house. I only have one that I can live in, and a reasonably small pension. But what happened to me is a case in point for the left, actually, because what happened to me was huge amounts of public vilification. Particularly people like Louise Ellman used every public opportunity. I mean, she was obsessed. I sometimes used to think of writing to her so I could actually meet her, so that she could deal with me face to face, because she was totally obsessed with me. So when she had a public meeting in Manchester, she brought my name up. But worst of all, she brought my name up and actually lied about me using parliamentary privilege. Now, what was the problem with these lies that were being told about me in the newspapers, on the all forms of media in Parliament, was that I was not given a right of reply. Now, it's really interesting here, because when I did a tour of Scotland, and just like they're doing now with Miller, they did actually attempt to attempt to shut me. Oh, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. No, sorry. They did actually attempt to shut me down. But what happened was the Scottish newspapers who reported on it phoned me up to give me a right of reply. And I said to this woman, I said, I've never been asked that ever before with a British English newspaper. They were totally shocked that basic, if you like, journalistic practice had never been given to me. And I could have defended myself. What I could have done is actually borne the silence of what happened to me. So I think there are two reasons why we have to limit it, actually, not just one.
Yes, well, I mean, I will say, as a journalist, it's the basic, the most basic part of journalism essentially is that if you're going to write something about somebody which is potentially damaging to them, then you give them the right of reply. So that seems the most basic form of journalism. And I will say that, the left press, including Squawk Books, which I write, often gets attacked for its standards, and we operate to a much higher standard than most of the so-called mainstream press because we're regulated by a proper regulator that complies with the Leveson standards rather than doing self-regulation, which is what happens with all the big titles. So yeah, I mean, that is pretty appalling. I mean, the right-wingers tend to out themselves with the way that they speak, and it's fairly easy to draw a line, I guess, against that kind of that talk. But what I want to move on to is the kind of left-on-left attacks, so to speak. We get a lot of issues where people demand that somebody else gets no platform because they've said something they don't like on an issue of importance to them among the left, and those attacks can, hopefully not as bad as waving baseball bats, but those attacks can get pretty extreme in terms of if somebody treads on somebody else's sore spot, so to speak. Jackie, if you're ready, we'll go back to you first on that. I mean, what's your take? How do we manage that issue of disagreement among the left, and who gets to decide, or who should decide, as to where lines get drawn and those kind of things? And I guess should there be more tolerance of each other?
Well, unless we're going to actually, establish some kind of Politburo or some kind of central commission. It seems to me to be absolutely plain that what has to happen is each organisation, every time a meeting is organised, that is decided. And I think to me that is just, pretty simple. Different organisations, different meetings will have different objectives. And I see nothing wrong with that being decided. But I think what we have totally got wrong in the last however many years, perhaps 5 years, perhaps 10 years, I'm not sure, is the no platforming of each other and people on the left. That has been absolutely extraordinary, really has.
Esther, you've been on the wrong end of some of this as well, so tell us.
Yeah. So if dissent is then taken as offence and then elevated into hate speech, the consequences for democracy and the way we talk to each other are quite alarming. I think that's happening now generally across the world. So there's somebody that's been posting smears about me in Bristol for the past 3 years, and she justified it by saying, you're standing with people who really have been unfairly smeared and are completely innocent of all accusations. So this person was saying that they were the arbiter of free speech. They were saying that anyone with whom they did not agree should be silenced. And that is completely unacceptable. It means that we can't talk about anything. It means that those people with opinions, with influence, can decide on what we talk about, on what we think, and when they decide what we think, we're afraid to speak, we're afraid to think, and we walk within very narrow parameters, the parameters within which those with influence and power can control what people say and think across the left. It's a very dangerous thing.
Tony?
Yeah, I agree with Esther. I think the rise of this intolerance for debate amongst the left is partly the result of identity politics, which have taken class out of the equation. So, for instance, people have the right to define themselves, and then you can't question it. And of course, the Zionists stepped into it. They said, we represent all Jews. You can't question us as to our definition of anti-Semitism. That's our business, not yours. So they shut you down if you try to, including, of course, anti-Zionist Jews. And the same is really true, the whole trans debate versus women's debate. I see that as primarily a question of identity politics, with different people differing as to how they identify themselves. And if you question that, you're a TERF or whatever, and then they say, well, you can't speak. But no, of course we have to debate these issues out. There is, between, if you like, trans right and gender critical ideology, a big debate to be had. And I'm not on one side or the other, but I'd like to listen to that debate and make my own mind up rather than others telling me what I have to believe in. And that is actually a sign of weakness as much as anything else. The fact is that lots of the left, a large segment of the left, have fallen for that. And we saw that very recently, where Momentum disguised their cowardice over the NEC elections by, in essence, calling Naomi Wimborne-Idrisi out because she refused to come down on one side or the other, refused to make a declaration. I think that a woman is a woman even if she isn't a woman, if you see what I mean. So, that kind of intolerance has spread to a large section, especially the soft left, which is what Momentum are in essence.
Yes, it's interesting that you use that word cowardice. It seems to me, and again, I'm a neutral, and that's why I'm chairing this debate, but it seems to me that when people try to shut down debate and refuse to have anybody on who expresses a certain view, there's an element of being scared that you couldn't defend your point adequately against somebody that would disagree with you, which, would seem, Jackie, let's bring you in again. What do you, is it cowardice to shut people down like that, or is it, is it is it political bullying? What's it about?
I think it's plain stupidity, actually, if you want me to be absolutely frank about it. And it's also extremely naive, and it goes together. There was a very interesting survey recently about how these things work. When you get little trigger warnings, they're now starting to give people trigger warnings, and they sometimes give them in universities or in other places. You might well see something that might upset you at this point. And what they've actually done, and there's been repeated research done on this, which shows that these trigger warnings, rather than getting people to stop watching, makes them watch these things even more, and actually has no protection on the people who are vulnerable. I mean, and actually what is really makes me angry about this, and I'm really not going to venture into the trans debate, because that way lies total madness in terms of any discussion on freedom of speech. But what really makes me angry about this is it's exactly the strategies of the right which have been adopted. You know, the fact that people are then spoken about in such awful terms, and that we have people who are then called, you know, you're as bad as Hitler, or, you know, you want to kill us, or any of this stuff. We can't have anybody like that talk, because otherwise I might feel threatened. I mean, I was an anti-racist trainer, and does anybody actually think that I made any progress by going into rooms where I didn't meet racists? I mean, you know, think about this. The first thing is, if you want to change opinion, if you want to get racist, become anti-racist, first you have to go and talk to them. And the second thing you have to do is, if you go and talk to them, you have to be prepared to hear some stuff that you're not going to agree with. And I think that's very important, that we learn again the value of debate and of dialogue. And let's think about this. And I mean, Tony knows this is exactly true. There is one reason why the Zionists refuse to debate with us, because they know that we would demolish them. We would demolish them intellectually. We would demolish them with evidence. And that's why they're reluctant to debate. And that's what we have to remember. Actually, how we open things up, how we challenge, how we change opinion is through debate.
Yeah, I agree with that. For the last 40 years, the Union of Jewish Students, which is now attacking other people in the National Union of Students, not least its president, Shaima Delali, who's been suspended, they try to stop me speaking on campuses, even though I'm Jewish. I mean, they failed on every opportunity. But I'll give you an example. One of the largest ever Union General meetings at Sussex University, this was at the time of the Lebanon invasion. I was a guest speaker at the Union General meeting. And the Union of Jewish Students got up and they opposed me speaking because I was an anti-Semite, even though I'd led or helped to lead the anti-fascist movement in Brighton itself. They lost that attempt pretty much decisively. And I spoke as a guest speaker, and one of the Zionists spoke, so there was but two of us. And the meeting voted by over 2-1 to support a democratic secular state in Palestine. And the reason is the Zionists literally have nothing to say. If you are defending an apartheid society, it's very difficult to defend why Palestinians, even inside Israel, who are citizens, have access to only 6% of the land, and Jews have access to 93% of the land. Non-Jews cannot rent, lease or own it. That's indefensible. Demolishing Palestinian houses on the West Bank to make way for Jewish settlers. How can you defend that? Of course you can't. How can you defend Jewish mobs chanting death to the Arabs in the streets of Israel, and it's the victims, the Arabs, the Palestinians, who are attacked by the police, not to those who are chanting these slogans? You can't defend it, so it's much easier just to say, oh well, you're an anti-Semite. That's what it is.
You want to come in, Esther?
Yeah, so people would silence you if they have a position of entitlement that they want to maintain and which they cannot justify. And the other area where this happens is where people have a misguided view of some sort of ideological purity, which again is a very dangerous thing. And it might really hurt them that people wouldn't see the world in their particular way. So they have to stop people talking about it because it doesn't stay within their parameters of what they consider to be that purity they want to maintain. And I think that's a real thing on the left. I think the other thing on the left, and Chris Higgins and I were talking about this before the meeting, is the witch hunting mentality, which does exist. It does exist in the Labour Party, and it does exist in parts of the left, including Momentum, where people appear simply to have an inclination to want to witch hunt. And when we allow free speech to be shut down, when we allow name calling, when we allow people to be condemned for thinking incorrectly, we're feeding the witch hunters. And that's what Labour Against the Witch Hunt was all about. And so if we want to stop the culture of witch hunting in the left, and this is one of the really important things that we have to say, we have to allow people to have a say and to think and to speak their minds and to debate. Otherwise, democracy is dead.
Who profits? Who wins from all this division that comes out and all the no platforming and the cancelling and everything else? Who benefits from it?
Well, it's those people who are entitled and want to maintain their privilege, and it's the ideological thugs, whomever they are.
Tony, in the broadest sense?
Well, I mean, who benefits from suppressing free speech? The people who rule us. That is, I mean, in no better example of closing down free speech than in Starmer's New Labour Party today. Motions which are held not to be competent, out of order, are routinely taken off agendas. They refuse to discuss these things. I mean, the reason given, I mean, in Hove Labour Party by the regional official Stuart Horner was that people might be offended, Jews might be susceptible. And I told him, I mean, that in itself is anti-Semitic, because what you're saying is Jews are more fragile than non-Jews, and they can't withstand debate and argument. But of course, it's not about that. I mean, the ruling class suppresses freedom of speech all of the time. That's how they get away with it. And so I support, for instance, when the Extinction Rebellion held siege to the newspaper offices in order to stop the newspapers coming out. That was a blow for freedom of speech, because those newspapers attack freedom of speech every day. When do we, me or Esther or whoever, when we're the target of the Daily Mail, when do they ring us up and ask us for our point of view? When are we allowed space to actually put the contrary view? I mean, 30 years ago, the Jewish Chronicle used to ring me up before they printed something about me, but under Stephen Pollard, that went by the board. I mean, they'd print anything they want. They would never contact you, and very rarely give you even a letter in reply, the right to reply in a letter. So, I mean, you know, it's in the interest of the ruling class in this society. They don't want freedom of speech. That's why the Tories are supported getting rid of anyone who's anti-Zionist, who speaks up amongst the academic staff, for instance. They've supported these purges, always in the name of free speech.
Jackie, give us your 2 pence worth on that, and then we'll move on a little bit. Say that again.
Who benefits are the people who have
who benefits? Yeah, from the cancellations and the division and
the people who benefit are the people who have the power to shut you down, and more often than not, they're the people with power. Unfortunately, too many on the left, and you know, it has happened, and Tony is right to refer to this, because of the paucity of understanding that too many's superficial understanding of identity politics has brought. You know, I want to go back to talking about race and class, and I don't want to be talking about identity in this kind of context anymore. The people who benefit are the people who have the power, and it's not something that the left should ever have been doing.
So if identity politics and all the stuff that goes around that plays into the hands of the establishment, is it, you know, is it counterproductive? Should we, you know, is it compatible with left-wing politics, essentially?
It distracts us. When we have a cost of living crisis, when we have the rise of fascism around the world, in Sweden, in Hungary, in the UK, the fascists aren't going to be allowing free speech, are they? We should be focusing on those real material issues that affect all of our lives, not on this distraction, which is identity politics, in my view.
Tony?
Can I just...
Go on, Jackie. We'll just bring you in before I bring Tony.
Can we just remember when identity politics really came on the scene, right? Blair used this. Blair used this to cover up his whole bunch of actually quite right-wing policies. You know, when suddenly it became fashionable to be sort of gay, then you had your identity politics. Identity politics is not the same as anti-racism. There are spaces in which to discuss identity. It's a different thing to identity politics. So now what we see is that the right use things like, you know, people's gender, people's race to defeat us. That's why they're pointing at the cabinet and they say, well, look at all these black people here trying to keep refugees out. You see, it's not racist to do it because they're black. And that's the ultimate place we end up with identity politics.
Okay. Have we learned anything this morning? What can the left learn and how can we improve?
Can I just reply?
Yeah, go on, Tony. Sorry,
very briefly. That identity politics takes class out of politics, because what it says is that all those of the same identity also have the same class position economically. And a good example, I mean, of how it's a reactionary form of politics actually goes before Blair in the invasion of Lebanon, when Spare Rib, the feminist magazine, printed pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist articles. And immediately you had Jewish feminists saying, anti-Zionism threatens our Jewish identity. So what they were saying is their identity is counterposed to someone else's identity. There's no means of distinguishing. I prefer what Sivanandan, the founder of the Institute of Race Relations, said. Our identity, we are what we do. In other words, identities are changeable. They're not fixed. They're not frozen in time. When we move into action, then we find our identity. That was what socialist Jews, of course, did. I mean, Zionism is a way of freezing Jewish identity. It's a kind of plastic image that really doesn't exist.
So does that mean that class is the only identity we should essentially be fighting for?
Well, it's the main means by which we understand the society we live in, and all other things, including racism, flow from it. You cannot understand them. You cannot understand any form of oppression unless you realise that it all flows from the way this society is organised, the concentration of wealth, the exploitation of labour power, and so on. All of that derives from the same source.
Yeah.
Identity politics simply involve one person against another person, and you can't solve the argument. I mean, it's so subjective, it goes round and round in circles.
Yeah.
So you have to place these things in context.
You merely have competing identities, hierarchies of identities, and as you say, you never get to the bottom of it.
Jackie, any last word before we move on to our last question?
Yeah, I just do think we do have to be careful, though, because that's the way the left have been able to, in fact, remove real conversations about race, and particularly about race. But of course, you know, my line would be, and I've said this before, that in fact, what race is or what colour is a sort of biological marker of your class. And that's what we're talking about. You know, when I walk into a room, people know immediately, even if it's on a subliminal level, that my ancestors were enslaved people, that once you as white people had the right to own me as a commodified unit. My class is embedded, my history is embedded in how I... Now, I simplified that hugely, obviously, but that's basically it. But I do think we have to be careful when, I suppose I'm being careful when I'm agreeing with Tony, although I'm fundamentally agreeing with Tony, but I'm not going to give him that everything. I'm not going to give everything. No.
I do think there's another issue here, which is generally about people being given permission to think. So, and it links to this idea of ideological purity that I've been talking about. So, I think it's increasingly the case internationally that people are just channeled into constrained areas of thought and are not taught to think. It makes it easier to manage people, and I think within the party we need to do everything we can to encourage people to think, to engage in dialectics. So if I want to understand Tony's ideas, we discuss it. I get to the heart of what Tony means. I try to understand it, and vice versa. We have to do that. I think there's a real danger about critical thinking being totally shut down generally.
Mm-hmm. I gather we've got Mandy, Clare joining us as well now on this discussion. Is that correct? Is she there? And we've also got Tina here in the studio with us while we bring Mandy in. And Tina, you were wanting to chip in on this.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. I think there is a view though that we should. Or there's a point we should dig in a bit deeper, and this is the one where actually we have differences of opinion, especially I think with Tony, which is this, free speech in general, yes, but not for A, B, and C. And your A, B, and C, I mean, there's different A, B, and C for different people. Your A, B, and C is racist and fascist. And I do have an issue with that on a number of levels. First of all, who says who the racists and the fascists are? I mean, we've been the racists in the last 7 years, isn't it? We've been called these anti-Semites. We've been banned from platforms because we're anti-Semites. You have, Tony, etc. So there is, if we allow this division between, yes, free speech, but not for everybody. The not for everybody. It depends who we allow to say who the not for everybody is. We've been called racist, as I said. Also, say there is a real racist. Fair enough. There's a real racist, and he's talking absolute shite. Let's presume it's Tommy Robinson, and he's followed by I don't know how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. People think he's a real good sort of working class chap, etc. And he speaks for us. Wouldn't we actually be better off if we put him on a platform with you, Tony, or Steve, or Esther, and debate him, show him up for the stupid head that he is, for the Zionist that he is, for the nonsense he talks on immigration, etc., etc. We can pick him apart, we can show how silly his arguments are, and maybe from the 10,000, 100,000 people who follow him, maybe a few will think, actually, you know what? I think this guy is wrong. I think Tony's got the much better arguments. Maybe, the socialism thing, I should maybe look into it a bit more. I mean, I'm hoping here, hope dies last. But wouldn't that be the better way to deal with these so-called racists and fascists?
Just before we get Tony in on that, Esther, you...
That is precisely my point about no platforming. So let them come on a platform with us, let us debate. If we refuse to debate, they'll go away and have a rally, and they'll stoke up hatred, and stoke up violence. So let's talk about it. Let's expose those views. Let's shine a really bright light on it. Let's understand where they're coming from, and expose the dehumanising behaviour and thought behind it.
Tony?
Yeah, this is idealist. It assumes we live in a rational society where you can gentlemanly debate out these issues, and then whoever is the better debater, has the better ideas, wins. Now, I'm not opposed to debating with Holocaust deniers. I'll even debate with Tommy Robinson, etc. But when Tommy Robinson exercises his right to freedom of speech in the context of a street meeting whose aim is to then incite violence against minorities living around there, Muslims, we should do all we can to stop that meeting. And I gave the example of the 43 group who stopped the fascists organising meetings because they knew that the free speech so-called at those meetings was about incitement of hatred against the Jewish people who lived in the East End. And so to allow his freedom of speech would have been to allow the violence that occurred later. The same in Weimar Germany. I mean, if the communists had got their act together with the socialists and had a united front, they could have defeated Hitler when he was early. And if that meant curtailing Hitler's free speech, I think that was a price worth paying.
Jackie, as a black Jewish woman, we need your input on this question.
Yeah, this is a tough one, isn't it? Look, I think if you've got people walking into an area to meet in order to engender hatred against those people, then you have a right and a duty as a socialist to try and stop them speaking. I do think we have to recognise there are different types of what would be called, in sort of theoretical speech moments. There are different styles of meetings, and I think we have to get a bit more agile at negotiating them. But I think the blanket ban, I mean, I would welcome a debate with the Zionists. I would totally welcome a debate with Tommy Robinson. The market thing is every time you ever ask them, come on, debate, it never happens. There was one lovely time when Wes Streeting, he was tweeting, he actually blocked me after this dialogue, and he said, I'd love Jackie Walker to come down here and start to my local synagogue and talk to us about what happened with Jews in the Caribbean. So I tweeted back to him, I said, fantastic, I'll come, please do arrange. And he blocked me. So what I'm saying there also is it's also about power. If you have an aggressive, racist group of people coming in en masse to that synagogue, that would be a different response to having me as one person going to that synagogue to actually make a statement. So I think we've just got to be a bit more subtle in how we're...
Yes, I think we have got Mandy now as well, so let's get her in on the discussion. I mean, the one kind of corollary with all of this is, so let's assume we have the person on whose views are considered unpalatable by, us or by some other group of people. So you have them in on the debate and then promptly get no platformed everywhere else by people who don't see things that way and can't, cope with the idea of having an unpalatable person on as they would see it on a debate, and that can happen across.
Steve, I should say, because we have Esther here, we've had people withdraw from this meeting.
Yes.
Who said, Esther, if Esther coming, they're not speaking in the same session. We didn't even invite her to that session. We invited them to talk about something totally different. Oh, if Esther there, her views on whatever it is it almost doesn't matter. But they're so beyond the pale, we cannot come to this meeting. 4 or 5 people actually who've withdrawn from this event because Esther will be here on the sofa, and that taints the whole event.
Yes.
At other times it's Jackie or Tony, etc. It's the left. When the left is doing it to itself, it's eating itself up. It's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. We're doing the job for the bourgeoisie, for the ruling class, if we even not platform each other. There's the World Transform people. The people who are going to the World Transformed who won't come here. They've been invited here as well. And it's because of people like Jackie, Tony, etc. This is exactly the problem why we're in such a dire state on the left, or it's part of the problem for sure, that we cannot even allow differences amongst ourselves. It's terrible. We're never going to get anywhere close to building a resistance that can take on the ruling class if we can't even allow differences amongst ourselves. The working class is full of people with different views, and if they see us squabbling over, you know, the right interpretation of A, B, Z, and what happened in the Soviet Union, and what's, you know, what is Zionism, what is antisemitism, these are important issues, but they shouldn't divide us into smaller and smaller groups that can't even talk to each other. This is the way to hell, and it's not the way to anywhere near socialism.
Mandy, if you were there, I want to bring you in, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've been on the wrong end of this kind of treatment by others as well.
I have, and I'd like to thank you for having Esther on and for having this debate about free speech on the left, because you've done it as event organisers, knowing that some people will withdraw, some people will say that you're fraternising with bigots. Some of that, yeah, but you've done it anyway, and I think it's important for us to do it, because when we think about that, when we think about some of the names that people are being called, some of the assumptions that are being made about people's characters, for people who say that they're on the left wing, to dehumanise other members of the left in that way is really quite serious, and it is something that it's important for us to question and to challenge head on, I think, even if that means that some people are going to decide to disassociate from us for doing so. I think it's a courageous thing to do, and it's a really important thing to do. And it's important that we on the left don't dehumanise people until we've heard what they've got to say at the very least. The no platforming on a lot of these issues, whether it's anti-Semitism and people who are anti-Zionist or opposed to Zionism, disagreeing with other people who are Jewish, you know, who are pro-Zionism, or whether it's around the trans issue and women's rights. If we have a media and we have a politics and we have an academic sphere where only one side of the argument is allowed to be heard, how can we possibly say that these other people are the names that we're calling them? How can we say it? We're not actually even listening to them. We're not allowing their voices to be heard. So it's almost like in the left, it's become normalised to have a Zoom culture where we press mute on someone and cancel them. That's a dehumanising thing for us to do. It's the last thing that people who regard themselves as left-wing or socialist should ever be doing to other human beings, in my opinion. So thank you very, very much for having Esther on, and thank you for covering this issue of free speech. I really appreciate it. If I could pick up on a point that was made around class and whether identity politics is a distraction and something that we need to park or not discuss. Would that be okay for me to just make a few comments on that as well?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. So, I mean, you know me. One of the main things I ever talk about is social class. I think that the working class, the traditional Labour voting working class population, has been alienated quite deliberately through Blairism from politics, from left politics, and certainly the Labour Party isn't a welcoming place for working class people. So class is something that I would advocate for all day, and we need to have that class-based discussion at the heart of everything that we do, and it needs to be at the forefront. But I think Jackie's right. I think things like racism, things like sexism, things like homophobia don't automatically disappear from happening, from being a lived reality for people, just because class should be paramount. So within our discussion as socialists, we need to have class always as the central focus. But I think part of that as well is recognising that within our class, within the working class, there are also other sections that have relative disadvantage, that have oppressions that they also have to deal with. And women are one of those groups, but it's become unfashionable to really care about or talk about women's rights and sexism. And I personally think that's one of the things that's made women's rights advocates on the left fairly powerless to the silencing that's happened against them. So again, on that basis, I think what you're doing here by platforming Esther is saying no to sexism, as well as no to blockers and muting people and blockers on freedom of speech. So that's just that wraps up what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I will, Tony's pointed out correctly, I didn't introduce you. Mandy is a councillor in, I believe, Cheshire, who was yesterday a host and chair on this programme, which is why I didn't introduce you in the first place. But, and yes, and I will say, you know, on that point of one-sided discussions, sadly, we haven't got anybody who identifies as trans on this show, and, you know, I wish we would. I don't know whether that's because people wouldn't come on or not, but, you know, I would love to be putting that side of the argument across as well, and try and see if there's ways for people to actually meet each other intellectually in some way, so there's a bit more understanding. Tina, you looking ready to come in on something?
just on that issue, we actually did try and put together an episode of Red Line TV on the trans issue, and we spent weeks, if close to a month actually, organizing it and trying to get different views on board, and it was a nightmare. We were attacked by both sides as, you know, anti-trans, anti-women. So we got called all sorts of names for staging a debate, staging what we thought would be a friendly discussion, you know, not the shouting matches that you see on telly on this issue, which is hotly contested. It is obviously something that we should discuss, and we should discuss in a calm and you know, friendly manner. I disagree with Mandy and Esther on this issue of the women's right versus trans rights. I don't think they are as opposed as some people seem to be, and we very much wanted to present the view that is opposed to Esther's views on a better way that I can do it, and we've tried to get trans activists along. We've tried to get trans speakers along. They were not prepared to. Nobody was prepared to actually have a discussion on this issue, and I find that troubling. I'm actually personally, I can see their point of view much better than, you know, I'm struggling more with the radical feminist point of view. But it was difficult to hear that the reaction from the point of view that I actually support almost put me off that point of view, if you get my drift. I thought it's terrible that there aren't trans activists who are prepared to discuss the issues in a calm way, and I found that very surprising and troubling, because again it gets back to that point. How do you actually, if you are trans and you're experiencing discrimination and oppression, etc., wouldn't it be much better to try and convince people who disagree with that, or who won't support you for whatever reason, or who don't think you should be able to go into a woman's toilet and that kind of thing? Wouldn't it be a good idea to debate with those people, and perhaps you can change their mind? But there is a sort of cutting off. You know, this is like what the Nazis did to the Jews. I think I heard that 20 times when we tried to set up this debate, which seems a bit over the top, to put it mildly. But you know, I'm not going to put myself into harm. They see it as harm. A discussion is harmful, and it's going to hurt them, and it's going to bring up issues or whatever. It's going to, you know, it's sort of almost depoliticized. You know, it's something we cannot discuss because it's going to hurt me. Well, all I can say is, if the working class is going to become strong enough again to pose a real danger to the ruling class, we haven't seen anything yet. They're going to come for us, not just with words. They're going to beat our heads in, and we really have to be prepared, intellectually, emotionally, but also, you know, to take on the police, the state when it comes. And I fear this debate of this culture of we can't debate this is making us a lot weaker than we really have to be when the time comes.
Esther, you're nodding your head.
There's that important point about harm, because none of us have a right not to be offended. And I said earlier that when any idea is escalated through offence into perceived hate speech, we lose the ability to discuss anything, because we need to understand each other if we have a different view, and we need to understand whether we need to adjust our view. If we can't have a dialectic about ideas, if we can't understand somebody's position, then there's no way we'll ever reach any sort of accommodation. I'm of the view, and there's no way that I would want to dehumanise or see it as less human anybody who's on a different side of a discussion than I am. And if they understand that, I don't see that anyone should be afraid of discussing their position and their ideas. I don't understand that if you have a real position which you can back up with experience and evidence, I do not understand why that should not be discussed.
We had the incident quite recently of Professor Kathleen Stock, who's at Sussex University, which is near where I live. In fact, I went to it. And she was accused by trans activists, because of her views, of threatening their physical safety. And I asked some of them, how does her expressing her views on this subject threaten your physical safety. It's a nonsense. The same was said about David Miller, of course, at Bristol, that the mere fact that he was an anti-Zionist and he expressed his views threatened the safety of Jewish students on campus. Are they such snowflakes that they can't withstand just basic criticism of the ideology that they were born into, if you like? I mean, it's complete nonsense. This whole safe spaces, as if there is a safe space under capitalism anyway. I mean, it's just a self-indulgence in
It's
the
a
end.
distraction, yeah.
I mean, you know, the thing that strikes me, and I'm the chair, so it's my opinions. I'm trying to keep out of this, and I don't take a position on all this because I'm neither trans nor a woman, and I don't feel qualified particularly to, to start judging and dividing. But if the left, as a general entity, refused to go into a TV programme to debate some Tory, Thatcherite person or Keir Starmer or whatever, I think we'd be missing an opportunity. And we all bemoan the fact that, by and large, the TV producers know full well that the left's going to win the argument if they get onto those programmes, so they don't invite them and they just allow, kind of so-called centrist and right-wingers to debate among themselves because, they want people to just be digesting that and not hearing anything else. So I really do wish we had somebody from the trans community on here to talk about this. I kind of understand why people would feel worried about it, etc. But I don't want this to be a one-sided discussion, and we're forced into that position a little bit. Esther, you're waving a finger.
Yeah. So you talked about the trans position. So in my view, that's the same as talking about the Jewish position. Mm-hmm. So when we had the Red Line TV programme, I was in discussion with a number of people who would identify as trans who were willing to come onto the programme. Miranda Yardley was happy to come and speak on the programme. And the panel thought that actually Miranda doesn't represent the views of the people that disagree with you. And so we don't really want Miranda on the programme. So it isn't about the trans gender community. It's about a particular position that a particular group of that community.
Well, it's the majority, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's the same as Zionism, saying the majority of Jews support Zionism.
Well, I think it's in the trans community. There's a stronger majority that would
is that what it's
identify.
about, though, if the majority won't even talk about their position?
Yeah, I agree.
Some
I mean,
people
it should,
in the trans community are very happy to come and talk, but we didn't think that was going to be.
Well, no, we wanted a debate. We wanted a debate.
But even
clearly,
so, you could have had a trans.
Sure, yeah, but not having a debate. You would have all agreed with each other.
I think that somebody's trying to come in. I'll bring him in a second. I think that is that's the danger and the problem all the time. That whenever you would get very clunky discussions here. For example, if you tried to always caveat the fact that there isn't one trans view, there isn't one Jewish view, there isn't one woman's view. So you end up using shorthands, which then cause their own problems, and that's the issue. But it is a fact that there is a spectrum of views across every community in just the same way. And I think that's one of the problems as an outsider looking in on that stuff, is that it tends to become as if everybody's homogenous. It tends to be assumed that everybody's homogenous, and then you don't understand what individuals and what people really think. Was that Jackie or Mandy trying to come in? I heard somebody.
It's very hard for us to come in from here because I've been waving my hand about. And
we've got the wrong person on screen. Jackie, hold up 1 second while we just bring you, because we can't see you talking.
Hello.
There we go. That's better.
Okay. One of the things that happens is that we go straight from this is causing me, I'm a bit upset, I don't want to hear this, to this feels like I might get murdered. And it's very interesting to see how that has happened and where this has actually come from. And if I remember rightly when we were doing the programme, and I really don't want to end up talking about trans. So I'm not talking about trans, I am not talking about trans. But what happened was that there was a certain section who said, I will only come on this programme if this programme agrees with me. Yeah? That was the point. And that is the equivalent to when people say, we will have a panel of people, but we will only have a panel of people who agree with us. It is the same kind of purity. It kind of reminds me of the most extremist, authoritarian sort of cultures. And we see that repeated now in the Labour Party as well. You're free to talk about anything you like, as long as it has been agreed by the Starmerites that you can talk about it. And as the left, we have got to stop doing that. It's as simple as that. We actually need to be able to have, I mean, can you imagine, as a black woman of 68, how often I have heard things, or I see things on the TV, or when I'm on a bus, or read things that make me feel sick and angry. Can you imagine what would happen if I refused to talk to any of those people about it? I would, you know what would happen to me? I'll tell you very easily what would happen, is that I would become instantly a black separatist, but not even just a black separatist. I'd have to be a black separatist within a tiny, tiny, tiny clique of people. That, you know, there is comfort in that, but it's not going to change the world. Banning people talking does not change the world.
Mandy's wanting to come in as well. I will just say, I mean, yeah, I think the right-wing dream, and probably the Starmer dream as well, would be to have us all in our little silos not talking to each other, where we can't organise against them, because the whole point is collective action gets things done. So, Mandy, what were you going to say?
Definitely agree with you there, Steve. I think that silencing and no debate certainly does divide the left, and it plays into the hands of the right wing. It divides us into ever smaller and smaller compartments, and that can't be good for left politics overall. But I also agree with what Esther said. There are strong parallels here with what happened with the producement of anti-Zionist views within the Labour Party. How do we know that the view that trans person who wanted to come onto Red Lines to talk about being trans and their perspective on this debate, how do we know that that's a small minority of trans people's views if they are the people who are being deliberately silenced and aren't invited onto platforms? If we're not hearing their voices because they're being effectively deplatformed, how do we know that that's a minority view within that community? We know from our experience within the Labour Party that it's not necessarily the case that just because some voices are platformed and shout louder, that they form a majority of a particular community. So I think that's a kind of red herring. Yeah, and I think I agree with the points that were made earlier as well, that when we have these very right-wing, very totalitarian tactics where people refuse to come on and discuss their point of view, they flatly refuse, or they'll only go on if the people who oppose them, who have their own oppressions within their own group, which is women, if they refuse to come on and talk, I think it is an indication that there's a strong likelihood that they know that their arguments and their logic and their evidence are going to fall apart under the spotlight. And I really don't think a robust left can really justify allowing that to happen. It's just not something that's healthy that we should be doing on the left. And then, Kathleen Stock was mentioned. She was bullied out of her role, just simply for stating her viewpoint, which is a legally protected viewpoint, that you cannot change biological sex. And she supports, the women's rights. That she opposes the undermining, what she sees as the undermining of women's rights. She had to have security in her home. We talk about people who are feeling that their life is threatened by her saying something like that, but it was her that had to have security within her own home. It was her that was bullied out of their job, and the unions actually worked actively against her and asked her employer to investigate her. So I think the unions have a lot to answer for in terms of their silence and their lack of balance on this issue too. The whole of the left media has to take a more sort of Yeah, a more balanced approach to this, because I think we're in dangerous territory where we are at the moment. We need to be hearing all sides of the debate, and nobody should be being deplatformed on this issue. Voicelessness and traducement is something we just shouldn't be doing to people on the left.
We're into the last 10 minutes or so of the programme now. Tina's wanting to come in, and then I want to move on to the last question. So Tina, jump in. But
I mean, on that issue with, I know we don't really want to go into trans too much, but actually I don't mind. I think it's an important discussion in the question of free speech. But I think there's a difference between what's been happening with the trans debate and the anti-Semitism. I don't think it's the same at all. For a start, I think we can presume, I think, that the majority of trans women consider themselves as women. They consider that they want to use women's toilets and want to be imprisoned in a women's prison, which I think are some of the issues that the radical feminists think is, there's issues with safety, etc. I think that a majority of trans women quite clearly see themselves as women, and that seems would be very strange if it was different. But just before I get on, I think the issue with the trans debate is, I think that it comes from the left. It's the left dividing itself voluntarily for some weird reason, and the right is jumping onto it. The Daily Mail supports radical feminists. I find that quite shocking, and I find that very worrying. I think it should worry the radical feminists that the Daily Mail and the Telegraph have no problem jumping onto that particular campaign. With the anti-Semitism, I think it was totally different. It was driven by the right to defeat the left, quite clearly. Some very small numbers on the left also thought, oh yeah, then we need to cleanse the left from anti-Semitism and from wrong viewpoints. But I think many just didn't want to speak up because they didn't want to get into trouble. But the anti-Semitism was driven by the right. It was a coalition of the right wing in the Labour Party, the right wing establishment, and of course the Zionist lobby. They all coincided, having happily the same target for a few years, was what Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters, and that's what's driven by the right. I think the trans issue is quite different, and it's quite unfortunately coming from within the left, dividing itself, which I find much more troublesome, and it's much more difficult to defeat that issue and to get over it because it's driven by ourselves in a very worrying way, I think.
Esther, a quick 2 minutes, and Tony, is that you want to come in?
Yeah.
The issue about the witch hunting mentality is the same, whether it comes from the right or whether it comes from momentum. There is a culture of witch hunting, and I think when we're talking about what do we do, it's not about a specific argument, it's what we do about that culture, it's what we do about those people who would constrain free speech. We're not having the argument about trans here because I would disagree with you and I would debate it with you. We're not having that argument. We're talking about what we mean by free speech and indeed what we mean by witch hunting and how we stop it. And that's what we need to be discussing.
Yes, Tony, I'll bring you in 1 second. I just want to observe the fact that happening to coincide with the Daily Mail and the Telegraph can happen and isn't necessarily a sign of any kind of ideological overlap or whatever. I mean, I get criticised regularly for criticising Keir Starmer because I think he deserves to be criticised. And the fact that the Daily Mail might criticise him on the same issue doesn't mean I'm wrong to criticise him. It just means that they see it as an opportunity to attack somebody that it's convenient for them to attack as well. Tony, go on.
Yeah, I think there are differences and there are similarities. One of the similarities is you call someone a TERF if they don't agree with what you're saying on gender ideology. And likewise, we were called anti-Semites by people who were racists and usually not Jewish, who took it upon themselves to define what it is to be Jewish. But there are also, if you like, differences as well. And that has to be recognised. I would say to people like Esther, I think it's quite important that radical feminists and gender-critical ideologists and so on make a very sharp distinction between their position and the position of the right, because the interests of the right are in attacking all sexual minorities, women included, who aren't the minority, of course, I accept, but they have a different agenda from people like yourself. And sometimes, like the recent drag queen affair, you had a coinciding, and sometimes people actually feminists standing side by side with overt fascists. I think that has to be recognised and understood, that fascists and the far right and the people like the Daily Mail are never your allies.
All the more reason to talk about it, Tony.
So I'm going to move on. We've got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask everybody to stick to 1 minute each. But the question is basically, can anything be done to improve the situation, or are we doomed to be the Judean Popular Front versus the People's Front of Judea, to quote the Monty Python situation, because people just can't get themselves into alignment with each other. So we'll go back in reverse order. Tony?
Well, I just think that everybody's been a very naughty boy, really, to be quite honest. They've been obsessing over virtually nothing. No, I mean, of course. I think the problem with the left is that a section of the left have abandoned class politics, and therefore they've become submerged in identity politics. And we do see where that ends up. The government's diversity agenda, that the worst possible government you could imagine, is virtually all black. I mean, that's where it ends up if you take class out of race.
Esther?
Yeah, so I think we need to recognise that in the left we must promote free speech. We must remove and reject this culture of witch hunting. The last thing I would say is, first they came for the so-called anti-Semites, then they came for the TERFs, and next they'll come for you.
Tina?
Well, we need a revolution on the left. We need a cultural revolution on the left. Unless we're able to embrace differences and actually view them as something positive and something that can help us developing and becoming better than the individual sects that exist, etc. They're not the answer. Clearly, we need to overcome seeing differences as a problem, and that's why we're doing things like this debate. Differences can be a very, very positive thing. Not obviously there are limits to it, in the sense that if you want to organize a demonstration and you all have different slogans, that would be a bit stupid. But in a run-up to something like that, you should have open debate. Everybody should feel empowered, because if we don't empower every single working class person to be able to say what they want to say and to fight for their ideas, they will never be won to the fight for socialism.
Mandy, 1 minute, and then we'll give Jackie the last word.
Hopefully do it in less than 1 minute. I think on the left we've handed this to the right. The right are making a real meal out of this because we've allowed people to be silenced. We've allowed women on this particular issue to be silenced. It hands a victory to the right wing, and they go to town on it, the same as they did with the antisemitism scandal. I think there's a lot that can be done. I think we need to have the dialogue. That's all that needs to happen. I think if you let us speak, you realise that we do have some quite compelling evidence for what we're saying. We're not saying what we're saying out of hatred. It's out of genuine concern, and we do have evidence to back up what we're saying. It would just be really nice if we could be heard, and if the left would allow us to have that conversation. Now, we started to do that on Resistance TV. We did a whole series called Set in the Summer, and you've done that. You've done that as well today. So thank you so much, really, for letting us come on.
Jackie, are you there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of really happy with the discussion, but a bit unhappy about this relationship towards anti-Zionism. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I certainly don't want to endorse the relationship between the two things in the way that I feel this has been done. I think we have to get to a point, yes, where we actually resist no platforming. We actively go out and engage with free speech. And if people feel that they are threatened, we actually ask them to press that rather than going away to do that. So I think free speech, yes, but of course with the provisos, as I've said before.
Thank you, everybody, for participating in a very interesting discussion, and thank you for watching. I believe we're going over to a poem from Kevin now, if I've seen the prompt correctly.
Music first.
Music first. So we have a music video from Kevin Prowse first.
Ian Prowse.
Ian Prowse, excuse me. And a great musician. How could I get that wrong? and then we'll be hearing from Kevin. So thank you very much, everybody.